students, welcome back. This is Dora's Elbow Bump. How are you? Are you doing okay? Is your family okay? Remember, if you need anything, please send me an email and I'm happy to help in whatever way I can. So lucky you get to hear my voice for another lecture. But the best part is we will start discussing type 1 and type 2 errors. Yay! In the last video, we started discussing null hypothesis statistical testing. Null hypothesis statistical testing is a formal approach to decide whether or not a statistical relationship in a sample actually reflects the truth in the population, or if it's just due to random chance. When we write the hypotheses, we're going to write two different hypotheses each time. Both of them should be written in terms of the population parameter. The null hypothesis is the hypothesis of no difference, and it describes what is happening in the situation currently. It also can describe what would happen if the treatment is not making any difference on the status quo, on what's happening now. The alternative hypothesis addresses the question. So if your question is asking if there is going to be any change, if something is going to decrease or if something is going to increase, it's going to be stated as the alternate hypotheses relative to the null hypotheses. When writing the null hypotheses, we use the notation H0, and H0 is the capital H with this sort of zero subscript. There's a colon, and then we use the population parameter notation. So here we have P, that would stand for population proportion, equals, and then we have the actual population proportion as it is believed to be. Again, this is the proportion as it is believed to be, that there has been no change, no surprises, no effect. The null hypothesis can also be called the hypothesis of no effect or no difference. And when writing the null hypothesis, we will always use the equal to sign. In this example, we used P because we're talking about the population proportion. If we were discussing the population mean and we were writing hypotheses with the population mean, we would use the notation of mu. I keep saying this over and over again because it's very important to remember that hypothesis testing is always about the population parameter. It's never about the sample statistic. We do this because we want to know what's happening in the population when we very often don't know what the truth could be. The other hypothesis that we write is the alternate or alternative hypothesis. The alternate hypothesis is written with a capital H and a subscript of either A for alternate or a 1. It has a colon as well. It has the population parameter notation, and then it will have one of three symbols. If we were looking for any change whatsoever, either a decrease or an increase, we're just looking for a change, then we would use the symbol of not equal to. If we were interested in looking to see if there had been a decrease somehow, either in the population proportion or the population mean, then instead of using not equal to, we would use the less than sign. If we were interested in studying an increase from the null hypothesis, then we would use the greater than sign. So depending on what your question is, will determine which symbol would go in here, whether it's not equal to, less than, or greater than. The only symbol that would not go in here is the equal to sign. That's the only symbol that cannot go in here for the alternate hypothesis. The equal to sign is only for the null hypothesis. Notice again that this is a P because we are talking about the population proportion. If we were discussing population mean, we would actually use the mu. Once again, I stress this because it's so incredibly important. When writing your hypotheses, they're always stated in terms of the population parameter. It is never stated in terms of the sample statistic. We do this because we're trying to infer what the truth is in the population using the information from our sample. We're trying to make the best most educated guess with as much evidence as we can obtain from our experiment to make a correct decision about what's happening in the unknown truth. Let's practice writing the null and alternate hypothesis with this example. It says, on April 23, 2020, Governor Cuomo reported the results of a study that showed that 21.2% of all New York City residents test positive for COVID-19 antibodies. Let's suppose that a researcher believes that the proportion of New York City residents that have antibodies for COVID has increased in the past month. Okay, so here it's saying that on April 23rd, this was the proportion. And the researcher wants to know if that's increased. So this is a good time to pause the video and think to yourself, what's the null and what's the alternative? So the null is what's expected. The null, H naught, is that the proportion is 0.212, right? Which is just 21.2% written as a decimal. The alternate hypothesis is trying to describe the question, has this increased, right? The question was, has this increased? So here, the alternative hypothesis is P, because we're talking about the population proportion. Has it increased? Has it gotten bigger than the expected population proportion, which was 21.2%, which is written as 0.212 as a decimal. So this is the null hypothesis and the alternate hypothesis. Once you've written your null and alternate hypotheses and you go through the study, there's a couple things that can happen at the end of the study. If, after you've finished your experiment, there is not enough proof to infer that there is a difference, then you're going to assume that your null hypothesis is the truth, and you're going to keep your null hypothesis. A way to say this is retain the null hypothesis. You are saying that there is no difference between the original, in this case 21.2%, and the new study's proportions, which is approximately the same as 21.2%. There is no statistical difference, and any real change is just due to random chance. What you will find is some textbooks and some researchers, instead of using the words retain the null hypothesis, they will use the words fail to reject the null hypothesis. In either case, what they are saying is that there has been no difference, that the null hypothesis was and is continuing to happen in the population. Another thing that can happen is after you have finished your experiment, there is enough proof to infer that there is a difference between the original population proportion of 21.2% and your study results. In this situation, you reject the null hypothesis. So by rejecting the null hypothesis, is you're saying that there is enough proof, there is a statistical difference between the original 21.2% and the new study proportion to suggest that there is a change, and it is very unlikely that the change is not due to random chance, that something is actually happening. Let's step away from looking at statistical studies and look at an example where everyday people are put in a situation where they have to either retain or reject the null hypothesis. We see this in courtrooms all the time. I'm going to bring up an example now that shows you a very famous case where this has happened. So, the case we're going to be talking about is the Oj Simpson Trial. And just to give you very minimal background on the situation, basically on June 12th, 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman were found stabbed to death outside of Nicole's condo in Brentwood in the city of Los Angeles. I'm not going to discuss the details of the case or whether I think that Oj Simpson is guilty or not guilty. It's really not important for our purpose. Before I go any further, I want to at least honor the people that were the victims of the attack. The woman that was one of the victims of the attack was Nicole Brown Simpson. She was 35 at the time of her death, and she was the ex-spouse of Orenthal James Simpson. The other victim of the attack was Ron Goldman. He was 25 years old at the time of his death, and he was a friend of Nicole Brown Simpson. If you're not sure who Oj Simpson is, he has been known for many different things. First, he was a fabulous football player. He played for USC and was the recipient of the Heisman Trophy. He later went on to have a distinguished career with the Buffalo Bills. And after retiring, he became an actor and starred in several films. And he also was one of the commentators for football games on national networks. During the investigation, Simpson was determined to be a person of interest in these murders. He was later arrested and tried in both the criminal and the civil courts. In other words, Oj Simpson had 2 trials. When a person is a member of a jury, they are given instructions. Just as in any jury, the Simpson jury was told that they should assume that Oj Simpson is innocent. That's the starting off point. Only if there is enough evidence to overturn the presumption of innocence should they find this person guilty. In that situation, what they're doing is that they are rejecting the null hypothesis because there is enough evidence in the testimony to say that the null hypothesis of innocence should be rejected and the alternate hypothesis of guilt should be assumed. Okay, this happens every day, not just with the Oj Simpson trial, but any jury is given these same instructions. As I mentioned, what makes the Oj Simpson trial unique and why I like to use it as an example for looking at retaining and rejecting null hypotheses is that he had 2 trials. The first trial was a criminal trial, and the jury decided that the evidence does not warrant rejecting the assumption of innocence, and Oj is found not guilty. Therefore, what the jury did is they retained the null hypothesis. Later, there was a civil trial. In this civil trial, Oj was found to be responsible for the murders. In this trial, the jurors determined that there was enough evidence that warranted rejecting the assumption of innocence. In the civil trial, the null was rejected. Now, if the criminal trial retained the null and the civil trial rejected the null, one of the juries had to be incorrect because he cannot be both innocent and guilty. Whether it was the criminal trial or the civil trial that made the mistake is really not important for our purposes here. But the fact remains, either Oj committed the murders or he did not commit the murders. So ultimately, one of these juries had to be incorrect. Let's look at the different possibilities that can happen when you're on a jury. This is the first possibility. So in this section right here, we have what is the truth. The truth really is unknown. Only perhaps God or the bigger being in the world knows the truth of whether Oj was guilty or not guilty. We really don't know for sure. Only he would really know for sure if he's guilty or not guilty. The jury definitely doesn't know, and they're presented evidence, and they're going to find him either not guilty or guilty. So here's the truth. He's either not guilty or guilty, and here are the jury decisions, either not guilty or guilty. If the jury decides that Oj is not guilty, and the truth is that Oj is not guilty, then the jury's decision matches the truth and no error was made. The correct decision was made because the truth matches the verdict. And this situation would be the same as the null being correctly retained. The jury starts here with not guilty with the assumption of innocence, and they do not move from the assumption of innocence. They decide that they're going to stay with that assumption, and it ended up being correct because that's what the truth was. So they correctly inferred the truth. In other words, there was not enough evidence to have them change the presumption of not guilty. there's another possibility of the jury being correct. In this case, the truth is that he was guilty. And the jury found that on the presented evidence, that they also believe that there was enough evidence that they should move from the presumption of not guilty, which is the null hypothesis, to the presumption of guilt. Here, their verdict of guilty matches the actual truth. So the truth matches the verdict, and there was no error made in the decision. In this scenario, the null was correctly rejected. The third possibility is this, that the truth is that OJ was not guilty. And based on the presented evidence, the jury decided that there was enough evidence to find him guilty. In this case, there was an error committed because the jury found an innocent person guilty when they shouldn't have done that. So, if this is true, then the civil trial jurors made an error because the truth did not match the decision. In this situation, the null was incorrectly rejected. They should have stayed with not guilty, but they felt that there was enough evidence that they could change down to guilty, and that was an error because the truth is that he was not guilty. The last possibility is that the truth is that OJ was guilty, and the jury decided that there was not enough evidence, and they found him not guilty. If this was the case, then the error was committed in the criminal trial because the truth did not match the verdict. In this situation, the null was incorrectly retained. So they should have rejected the null, but they did not. In other words, a guilty person was found not guilty is an error. These two different types of errors have names. If you do not reject the null when the null is false, that is a type 2 error. When you reject the null when the null is true, that is a type 1 error. So in our example, a type 1 error is that the truth was that OJ was not guilty and the jury found him guilty. In this example, a type 2 error would have been that the truth is that OJ was guilty and the jury found him not guilty. That would be the type 2 error. In this situation, if a type 1 error was committed, then the jury found that OJ was not guilty and the jury found him guilty. That's what happened in the civil trial. If a type 2 error was committed in this scenario, then what happened is that the truth was that OJ was guilty and the jury found him not guilty, then the error would have been committed in the criminal trial. So, in short, a type 1 error occurs if the null hypothesis is rejected when it's actually true. A type 2 error happens when the null hypothesis is not rejected and it's actually false. There's always a chance of making one of these errors, and we're going to talk about how to minimize this chance in our next video. Let's go back to our COVID study to see how the retaining and rejecting of the null hypothesis would happen with this. Okay, so as a quick review, these are our null and alternate hypotheses, and the H0 is that the proportion is equal to 21.2%. That's what it was on April 23rd, 2020. We want to know if it has increased since then, so our alternate hypothesis is that the current proportion has increased since the proportion that was on April 23rd, 2020, which was 21.2%. Okay, and we're using the greater than symbol because we're only interested to see if it increased. We're not concerned if it has decreased or there has been any significant change. Okay, so these are the possibilities. Who knows what the truth is? We don't have any way to know how many people in New York City have these antibodies, right? The only person that would know is God or a higher being or something that actually knows. We're trying to infer as best we can based on what evidence we have. So the truth continues to be unknown, okay? And the researcher is going to be making a decision based on evidence from the study. Okay, if the truth is that the number of antibodies has not increased and the researcher makes the decision based on the results that there is not sufficient evidence that the people that have COVID-19 antibodies has increased from the original proportion of 21.2%, then they decide to retain the null. Another way of saying this is they decide to fail to reject. I just like to say retain. Basically, they're keeping the null, the decision is going to be correct, and there has been no error made because the researcher's decision matches what the truth is. The other possibility is that the truth is that the proportion of New Yorkers that have the COVID-19 antibodies has actually increased. And the study shows that there is sufficient evidence that the percentage of people with COVID-19 antibodies has increased from 21.2%. Then what they have done is they have gone from the null of no difference, right? They've rejected the null of no difference, and they've gone with the alternate hypotheses. If the truth is that it has increased and the researcher says there is enough evidence to show that is increased, then the decision is correct. The decision to reject the null was correct. The study provided enough evidence that it is reasonable to assume that the truth is the same as the study. The decision to reject the null is correct and no error has been made. Another possibility that can happen is that the truth has not increased. It's actually still 21.2%. But based on the evidence in the study, there is enough evidence that the researcher decides to reject the null and assume that the alternate hypothesis is correct. In this case, the truth does not match the decision, and so the decision is incorrect. By incorrectly rejecting the null, the researcher has made a type 1 error. The last possibility that can happen is that the truth is that the proportion of people that have the COVID antibodies has actually increased. But something has happened in the study that based on the evidence, there is not sufficient evidence to decide that it has increased. So the researcher decides to retain the null incorrectly. The null should have been rejected, but it was retained. In that situation, the researcher has incorrectly retained the null, the truth does not match the decision, and a type 2 error was committed. So to summarize using our COVID example, a type 1 error would have been committed if the truth is that the proportion of New Yorkers with the antibodies is still approximately 21.2%, but the researcher decides that based on the results of the studies that the proportion has increased. They incorrectly rejected the null. A type 2 error would have happened if the truth is that the proportion of New Yorkers with the antibodies has actually increased from 21.2% since the measurement was taken on April 23, 2020. But according to the researcher's study, that shows that there is insufficient evidence to show that it has increased. So they have incorrectly retained the null. So what's the big idea? Today's big idea is that the null and alternate hypotheses guide the final decision of the study based on the results. Either the study shows that there is no difference from the current state, which is the null hypothesis, or there is a difference from the current state, the alternate hypothesis. When the decisions are made about which hypothesis is supported, the researcher can either be correct or incorrect. If the researcher's decision matches the truth, then no error has been made. However, if the truth does not match the decision, there are two possible types of error, type 1 error and type 2 error. A type 1 error occurs when the null hypothesis is incorrectly rejected. A type 2 error occurs when the null hypothesis is incorrectly retained. So that's it for today. With that said, don't forget to check your emails, check Blackboard, do your homework, and subscribe to this channel. Even better, hit that notification bell so you know when there are new videos for this course. Okay, this is your teacher Taurus saying stay safe, and I will be waiting to give you a virtual elbow bump in the next video. Ciao!